Thanks, Khalik, and thank you again to all of those who have joined us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are, for a really important discussion on the selective service. The selective service system exists to collect information about people in the US who could be forced to join the military in the case of a draft. Most men ages 18 to 25 who are US citizens or residents are required to register under this system, and they face penalties if they don't, regardless of the many, many reasons why somebody may choose not to register. And this is an issue that's really closely tied up with the origin story of my own organization. I work with the American Friends Service Committee, which was originally formed to provide alternative service to folks who were conscientious objectors, so they couldn't participate in war due to religious beliefs. And this question of should the US be forcing people to participate in militarized systems is a big one. It's continuing up to the present day, where we're seeing renewed interest in Congress for legislation that addresses who should be required to register for a potential draft. So that's what we're delving into today, this really longstanding issue that has affected many of us, many of our organizations. And I'm joined by several colleagues with deep expertise and experience within this movement on the selective service and the draft. We're going to be talking about what this system is. We're going to be talking about what the problems are that we see within the system itself, what's been happening with Congress in relation to the selective service, and also how you can get involved with advocacy on the issue. I mean, I know many of you are really passionate about anti-draft organizing and the selective service. So we're going to have an opportunity after we have a conversation with our panelists to make calls to our representatives and senators on this issue through what's called a phone zap. So we're really excited to have you all here, excited to have a panel discussion and to do some advocacy. Thank you all for joining, and let's get this panel discussion started. I have 4 speakers joining me today, and I'll do quick introductions for each of them. Bill Galvin is a conscientious objector from the Vietnam War era. He is currently the counseling coordinator with the Center on Conscience and War. Welcome, Bill. We also have Edward Hasbrook, who maintains the resistors.info website about the draft registration, and draft resistance. As one of only 20 people prosecuted for resistance to draft registration since the end of the US war in Indochina, he spent 4.5 months in a federal prison camp in 1983 to 1984. He is a member of the War Resistors League and an activist for peace, human rights, and youth liberation. Welcome, Edward. We also have Mac Hamilton, who is the advocacy director at Women's Actions for New Directions, also known as WAND, where she works with grassroots and organizational partners to advance efforts to reduce military spending, promote nuclear disarmament, and advance peaceful conflict resolution. Previously, Mac served as executive manager of STAND, the student-led movement to end mass atrocities, where she collaborated with youth leaders in the US, UK, France, and Rwanda to work to end and prevent genocide and mass atrocities around the world. And finally, we have Maria Santelli. She has been the executive director of the Center on Conscience and War since 2011. CCW is an 81-year-old organization dedicated to extending and defending the rights of conscientious objectors to war, including young people facing selective service registration and members of the military who, after experiencing a crisis of conscience, seek discharge as conscientious objectors. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I think it's clear from those bios that we have a wealth of expertise and experience on everything from the draft to selective service system and feminism and militarism. So I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say about the selective service system and where we are today. Let's get started with a real basic question that I think will set us up for a good conversation. What is the selective service system? How has this system been used historically, and how is it being used now? And I'll ask Maria first. What is it?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tori. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. The Selective Service System was first established in US law for the draft of 1917, World War I. And it was meant to administer the draft, to draft people into the Army. It was essentially an arm of the US military. And as many of the friends here today and others will be well aware of, when a person was received an induction notice, they were considered in the military in World War I, and there were very little protections for anyone who chose to resist. And through with the facilitation of selective service, thousands of men were brutalized at the hands of the U.S. Army. Then on the eve of World War II, when it was clear that the U.S. was going to enter World War II, there was another draft law enacted in 1940, and that's when CCW's founders, which includes Friends and the other historic peace churches, along with the Methodist Office of World Peace at that time, ensured that the Selective Service would be established as a civilian agency, and that they would also administer an alternative service program so that conscientious objectors and others with opposition to being drafted into the military could serve in civilian directed service programs. So they were still drafted, but they didn't serve in the military. Today, the mission is still supposed to be twofold, that they maintain a list of potential draftees. Right now, that's men between the ages of 18 and 25, either US citizens or those that reside in the US. And the second half of their mission is still to maintain an alternative service program for people who would refuse military service. But due to many failures within the structure of the agency itself, it's not able to maintain a workable list, an effective list, in the event that Congress were to declare a draft. So by default, basically, the agency has admitted, and other experts have admitted, that the purpose of selective service right now, the reason it's being retained in US law, is to provide personnel to military recruiters, to provide names at recruiting leads to military recruiters, as well as to show the world that the US can be ready for a war at any time. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Edward to hear what else you have to add on that.
Yeah, very well put, Maria. I would add, to kind of wrap this up, the selective service system is not only part of contingency planning for a draft were it to be activated, it's part of active war preparations on an ongoing basis, but it also plays a key role in war planning, because it's the availability of selective service as a fallback, as Maria and I and others here have heard military spokespeople say in recent years. It's the availability of the selective service system as a fallback that makes it possible for the military to plan for endless, unlimited wars without having to worry about whether they're going to run out of soldiers or have to deal with the question of whether people would actually be willing to fight those wars. So it plays an absolutely essential role in the ability of the government to plan and carry forward war without end, without limits, forever wars.
Thanks, Edward. Just as a reminder to our audience, feel free to add questions in the chat as our panelists are speaking. That way we can ask them directly after some of these questions. And then we'll also have a question and answer session at the end of the panel. So feel free to be collecting those questions in the chat as we go through this conversation. Bill and Mac, is there anything you want to add on just the selective service system in general and what it does currently?
I think it's been covered very well. A thing that I have learned while educating myself on this topic is that 1940 was the first year that a peacetime draft was ever enacted. And to me, that's particularly important. I think it shows that prior to this, drafts would only be enacted if there was an active war in which we might need to bring in non-volunteers and force conscription. And I think that's a piece of it. And then to mention as well, in 1975, President Ford terminated the draft registration requirement. And then in 1980, it was President Jimmy Carter who reinstated the peacetime draft. So there's actually been a lot of movement, in the past 100 years when it comes to how we're thinking about military preparedness and how we're thinking about the draft and forced conscription. So I think all of that context is helpful to frame the conversation.
Thanks for that, Mac. And I know some of our speakers and panelists today have direct experience with this system. Edward and Bill, I'd love to hear about your own personal experiences with this. And then after you share, Maria, if you want to share some of the other harms that you've seen come out of this system on folks who are either forced to register or drafted.
Well, for my personal story, I mean, I was a conscientious objector, and I had a pretty traditional, regular conscientious objector kind of claim, based on Christianity. Jesus says, love your enemies, things like that. I was planning to be a minister. And so I was not like just somebody who was, trying to make something up. I mean, I knew the scripture pretty well. I was pretty serious about my faith and was very active in my church. I had support of my church, my parents, and there was nothing weird or unusual about my conscientious objector application, and yet they turned me down. And for selective service to be turning down someone like that, somebody like me who clearly qualified, you just got to think about all the other folks that who had legitimate conscientious objector claims that just did not get a fair hearing at all. And we've actually heard draft board members in the past say things like when they're in a county like in Lancaster, where there's a lot of Mennonites, well, we have to give it to the Mennonites, but we're not going to give it to anybody else if we don't have to. Well, the law says it's based on what you believe. And so draft boards were just horrible at accurately implementing the law and giving people the deferments and the exemptions they qualified for. I mean, that's just my personal story, but I could tell you thousands.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, Bill, because I don't think most people realize that there actually are today draft boards in every county in the country. There are 10,000 trained and prepared draft boards ready to administer this process, or unready to administer this process, or ready to administer it in an arbitrary and unfair way. My own story, I came of age during that period that Mac alluded to, when the draft and draft registration had been completely suspended. We thought ended for good. So my experience was kind of like the young women growing up now who haven't thought about this. And then, I was suddenly hit with it in 1980, just as young women are going to be hit with it probably in a year or two. And when I first spoke out about my refusal to register at a press conference at the AFSC office in Chicago in 1980, I was joined by people who were opposed to the draft from a variety of perspectives. There's so many things that are wrong with it. Some of them primarily anti-war or anti-imperialist, some of them primarily anti-authoritarian. I came to it, the draft being a system that targets exclusively the young, from my perspective and my background in involvement as an activist for youth liberation. The draft is the ultimate ageism. But whatever your reasons, at first I thought, why am I being targeted? But then I realized, no, wait a minute, this is an opportunity. I have the power. They want us to sign up for the draft. They want us to submit because they depend on us. And it was a place in which young people who are not normally even consulted actually wielded the power if we recognized it in that Gandhian kind of way. Or as one of my mentors, Dave Dellinger once put it, we have more power than we know. And so it was an opportunity at a time when, like today, of resurgent militarism in many ways under President Reagan, that we as young people had the power that other people who weren't being called upon to fight the wars didn't have, that by nonviolently withholding our cooperation, we actually could directly influence the ability of the government to wage war. And so it became, for me, resisting the draft became one of the most profoundly empowering things I've ever done that has shaped the rest of my life, because I know that popular direct action, nonviolent action, can have an effect. And I've known that for decades. I and a few other activist organizers, prominent people whose public statements could be used against them to prove the case, were prosecuted. We were speaking out not to keep ourselves out of the draft, but to protect the world against war. And even though a few of us went to prison, very quickly the government realized that there were far too many people who had simply mostly just quietly stayed home and ignored it. But that's still a powerful statement. There were far too many to prosecute. The government threw in the towel. So we won this profound victory over the draft, but we've lingered in a stalemate for decades since, where it was impossible to enforce the registration requirement, much less the requirement that people report to the Selective Service every time they move, which nobody does. But the law remained on the books, with the crucial consequence that the government was able to continue to pretend that the draft was a policy option. So we still need to push it today, that last mile, to get recognition of that. But it has been actually, strangely, as I mentioned, really an empowering experience. And I want to get young people today to recognize the power they have over war making, and to get older people to recognize the leverage that can be held and the importance of allying themselves with the young people who are making those choices.
Thanks, Edward. Maria, as you take on this next part of the question, I want to loop in one that's come through on the chat, which is, how has racism been a factor in the Selective Service? So as you're talking about the harms that we've seen from the Selective Service system and drafts, if you could loop in that component and answer that question.
Absolutely. And I think Edward is so right that the government realized the power that these young people could have, and that the public prosecutions were having the opposite effect. They were actually increasing non-compliance. And so instead of allowing, people engaging in civil resistance and civil disobedience, which is a grand American tradition, and people, especially people of conscience and people of, people who act on deeply held beliefs, good trouble, right? We love hearing that thrown around, but they're not, the folks that resist registration these days are not given their day in court. They are punished extrajudicially, which is, of course, out of line with our values and our Constitution in this country. So somebody asked about the Solomon Amendments. So once the government realized that these public prosecutions of the 20 people, as Edward mentioned, were not working, they started to pass laws to coerce people into registering. So you saw the connection with federal student financial aid, which, hamstrung a lot of people. That was just rescinded by the Department of Education, actually made effective on Monday, August 16th. So no longer will a young person need to be in compliance with Selective Service in order to access federal financial aid for school. But many states hold that as a stick. Also, someone asked about driver's licenses and state IDs. This is on our website, centeronconscience.org. We have what we think is an up-to-date list of all the state laws. But yes, so a young person, when in most states, I think it's some 44 states, and the District of Columbia and other US territories require someone to opt in. So it's not an opt-in, they require you to prove you're registered or that you will allow the state to register you. So this does include young people who are under the age of 18. So this is an unlawful practice that's happening in most of our states. And how is this racist? Well, of course, we know that race is an instrument of class, no question about it. So if you are depriving people of these public resources, like driver's licenses, state IDs, access to state institutions of higher learning, or access to student financial aid, that's certainly going to impact people of color and other marginalized communities in a much greater way than it's going to impact people who have privilege. Of course, we know that the draft was racist, and then military recruiting. So as we mentioned at the top of the hour, one of the practical functions of this list currently is a registration. I mean, is a recruitment tool. So young people are threatened with all of these penalties, as high as $250,000 fine if you were to be prosecuted, 5 years in jail, a federal felony. We're doing all of this in order to furnish lazy recruiters with leads. That's offensive. It's offensive to folks from the traditional peace churches as well, particularly because of the work that people did, friends and others, to make sure that the Selective Service would be a civilian agency. So they have this revolving door relationship now with the Department of Defense. And we know that recruiting is predatory in low income and marginalized communities. So I hope that answered all the questions.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Oh, Bill, you want to share?
Can I just add one other thing? I mean, back about 15 years ago, Charles Rangel, who was a member of Congress, he talked about, he had a proposal for a draft that was going to be fair. It was not going to have all these kinds of loopholes for wealthy folks and things like that. And his proposal would only have had 2 exemptions: hardship and medical. And a study of 1968, which was the peak year for draftees during the Vietnam period, found that middle-class folks were twice as likely to flunk the physical as poor folks. Now think about that, okay? Do you think that's because they were half as healthy? I mean, the draft, just by its nature, I don't think there's any way at all that you can make it fair.
And I would add to that the most fundamental unfairness of the draft is that it puts its entire burden on the young. It is crude, bluntly, life and death ageism. And even if it drafted all the young, it would not be fair.
Thank you all both for sharing your experiences and just the harms you've seen done by this system over the decades of work that you've all had on this. There's another question in the chat that I think leads us perfectly into our next piece of the discussion, which is there a place for some kind of national service in this discussion? And national service definitely got its day in the sun over the last few years with a commission that was talking about the draft and national service issues. There's been a lot of movement generally from the Supreme Court to the Senate recently on issues relating to service, and especially the Selective Service, and also the idea of expanding this registration requirement to women. So can you all tell me, what's going on with all of these moving pieces? Why are groups pushing back against this proposal to expand the draft and registration in the Selective Service to women? And why is this conversation important even when we don't have a draft? Maria, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So in 2016, during the discussions in the Congress on the must-pass National Defense Authorization Act, the Pentagon spending bill, basically, there was a provision put in the Senate side to expand registration to women because combat jobs were open to women fully in 2015. And so the rationale for previously upholding the male-only draft had dissolved overnight in that way. So the Senate, John McCain, with no debate, entered the provision into the NDAA, and it was in the Senate version. The House had debate and defeated it, and this was a Republican-run House at the time. And so they went into conference, and the compromise was to establish the National Commission on Military, National and Public Service. And they were tasked with exploring all aspects of selective service to see, is this something that is still relevant in the modern era? Is this something we still want to maintain? If so, what changes might be made to it? And then also let's look at national service. And what then unfolded in the next 3 years with this bipartisan commission of 11 members, if I'm getting that correctly, was it 11 members? And I believe there were only 3 who had no direct connection to the military or the military industrial complex. So even though they were bipartisan, they were all people who took as a given that military service or military force was an appropriate foreign policy tool, and they took as a given that we were not questioning that. We were not questioning the existence of and the prevalence of militarism in U.S. foreign policy. But yet the roadshow that they put on was largely about public service, community service. And this has been the discussion. So you had folks, great programs, AmeriCorps being represented and all kinds of other national service programs testifying at the value of national service and all these things. But what the commission did find is that there is no public appetite for mandatory service. Is that service if you're forced to do it? Is that service if you're compelled to do it? And so that was the fact of what they discovered. And so I think the conversation has largely been over the last couple of years has been, folding in some kind of mandatory service, either military or otherwise. And it's been our view that this is just to kind of make the public, to make a military draft more palatable to the public. But I think service programs certainly should exist in this country. They should be well funded and they should be voluntary. So I'll hand it off to someone else to give, to kind of take other parts of that question.
That's really great, Maria. I'd love to kind of talk about the gender issue, the feminist issue. And that fits really well into a discussion of what's been happening in the Supreme Court. So to take us back to 1981, there was a court case, Rostker versus Goldberg. Rostker was running the Selective Service at the time. The Supreme Court ruled in that case that because the purpose of the draft is to prepare troops for combat, and at that time in 1981, women were excluded from combat roles, it was determined that it was constitutional to retain a men-only draft. Fast forward to 2013, between 2013 and 2015 is the time that combat roles were being opened to women. It happened in a tiered fashion. And in response, an organization called the National Coalition for Men, who I can talk a little bit about as well, filed a lawsuit against the Selective Service for discriminating against men in requiring men but not women to register for the draft. The case was dismissed, but when the ban on women was fully lifted, the ban on women in combat roles was fully lifted in 2015, the legal argument was gone. It was rendered moot. For a little bit of context on the National Coalition for Men, this is an organization that calls themselves a men's rights group. They have routinely harassed women who are survivors of sexual assault, whose court cases were dismissed due to a lack of evidence. They've also challenged single gender domestic violence shelters, and they've opposed the Violence Against Women Act because they have said it would empower false accusers. So just to give folks a view of who this organization is and what their intentions are, they're not positive intentions for equality by any means. So this left it to Congress, basically, to decide what to do, whether or not to expand the Selective Service or not. As Maria mentioned, in 2016, the Senate and the House came to a decision to create the commission. The commission closed and delivered its report, I believe, in 2020, sounds something like that, early 2020. And then this year in June, the Supreme Court declined to review the Rostker versus Goldberg case because Congress has been evaluating the issue. So really where we are right now is that it's up to Congress to debate the issue. When it comes to the feminist view, I've had to have a lot of conversations about this recently. I think there's both a macro level and then there's an individual level for what this issue revolves around. On the macro level, war causes immeasurable harm to women, children, and societies around the world. We at WAND support a nonviolent foreign policy that emphasizes diplomacy, emphasizes de-escalatory and nonviolent conflict resolution rather than military first approaches. And ending the selective service for both men and women supports changing that overarching approach to US foreign policy. So that's a core reason that this matters to us. And then on an individual level, military service should be voluntary. It should not be forced. You've heard, throughout this conversation that this really is an unjust system. And we believe that equality of oppression is not equality. And to me, feminism is really about challenging unjust systems. This is an unjust system for men. And as a feminist, I stand with men who are subjected to the system. And I will oppose any effort to impose an unjust system on women. And then I think the final thing I'd like to say is that we know that there's rampant sexual and gender-based violence and racism in the military. Look at how many veterans were involved in the January 6th insurrection on the US Capitol. The military is currently conducting investigations into white supremacy in our armed forces. And so we're extremely concerned that in the case of a gender blind draft, women and especially women of color will suffer disproportionately.
Thank you, Mac. I think, of all the voices that were absent, I was the only draft resistor who was invited to testify before the National Commission. Did the best I could, but the voice that was most absent from the debate as they framed it was that of even the existence of an anti-war feminism, which they really should have heard from. But in terms of why this is important, even if we don't have a draft, we've had, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of stalemate where we had a half victory, I would put it. We'd stopped the draft, but the government is still planning and operating on the basis that a draft is a possibility. So we haven't realized the benefits of that draft direct action victory yet. Because of this question of the continued constitutionality of drafting men but not women, Congress has been forced to confront an issue that they've really been evading. I mean, Congress doesn't want to admit that a government demand of the people was defeated by popular direct action. Federal legislators are not inclined to admit failure in the face of mass civil disobedience. So they really have been just trying to avoid the issue. They've been forced to put it on their agenda this year. If they put it back, if they don't do anything, which is a possibility, this could go on for decades more, where they're just planning for endless war and assuming that they can always get the bodies from a draft. So it's key to take this opportunity where Congress is having its first debate on the draft in decades, to try to make that choice they're making be not to expand it, but to end it, because it really is an opportunity. This would be one of the most profound victories of the peace movement in decades. And one of the few ways in which a lot of peace activists, certainly I suspect a lot of people on this webinar, feel very powerless. This is a way to wield real, direct, nonviolent power to actually constrain the government's ability to wage and prepare for endless wars. And I can't stress that heavily enough. But it's a limited window of opportunity. If this goes back on the back burner, we're stuck where we are for decades before it can happen. And because of the way it's been leveraged, we actually face a very, very real threat. This is important because I wouldn't want young women to have to face what I and other men have been facing for decades, as Max said. So it's an opportunity.
Thanks, Edward, and thanks, Mac, for those great perspectives on, why it's feminist to oppose the draft and the selective service expansion. That's in opposition to a lot of the rhetoric we hear coming out of Congress and elsewhere about how this is a good thing for equality. We know that isn't true, and I really appreciate the lens you brought to that. as we've noted a couple times, this is an active conversation in Congress, something that's moving right now, and that folks have an opportunity to advocate on. So I'm hoping that you guys can update me, where are we right now with Congress? What can we do to advocate for an end to the Selective Service rather than this expansion that's being talked about? And what do we need to do beyond lobbying Congress right now to really use our power to fight back against this militaristic attitude?
I can start us off, and I'm sure others will have things to say as well. So last month, I believe, they're all melding together a bit, the Senate Armed Service Committee included a provision in their version of the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, a provision to require women to register with the Selective Service. There was a little bit of pushback, particularly from Republicans on the committee, that their perspective is far from my perspective. It's more of a paternalist perspective of protecting our daughters. But those are the folks who are making noise on this. As it currently stands, Democrats seem to be taking the stance that this is an equality issue. So we're really working to doing our best to debunk that and to show that there is popular opposition to this, and that, combat roles are open to women, and, the service can and should be voluntary. So we're trying to figure out what the House Armed Service Committee is going to do with their version of the National Defense Authorization Act. And we're, imploring them to have a stronger level of debate than the NDAA process allows for, since it is must-pass legislation. What gets into the base text of the bill usually is what's passed. So I think our biggest hope right now is in the House of Representatives, where there's some really good progressives who we should be having conversations with to oppose the expansion. And yeah, Maria, do you have things to add as well?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, so I think just to underscore again, the point that Mac just made is that Democrats, I think in a way, I feel like they're being backed into a corner. The Republicans have already stated they're going to make this a culture war. So the Democrats, if they don't see an alternative, and there is a bipartisan, bicameral alternative, there's a bill in the Senate to repeal selective service in its entirety, and while overturning the penalties and protecting conscientious objectors, and a companion in the House, Senate Bill 1139 and House Resolution 2509 to repeal the Selective Service Act. And so we want to make sure they know there's an alternative. As Max said, registering, expanding the draft to women and all of the burdens that come with it, all of these penalties, does nothing to advance women's equality. So we can't let Democrats be backed into that corner of being accused of maybe being sexist or something. There's nothing that expanding the draft to women is going to do to enhance women's opportunity in the military or elsewhere. Every combat position is open. Every position in the military is open to a woman. This does nothing to address a problem that they've fabricated here. But the real problem, we heard this, we met with Representative Vela's office yesterday, and he represents a district in Texas, and his office was saying, I think he'd be hesitant, to abolish it altogether. But why? Because they want to reserve the right to draft people for an unpopular war. After 9/11, a war wasn't even considered, So if people who feel militarism is the right choice, feel the country is threatened, they've shown they'll volunteer. Others, like the traditional peace churches, have served in other ways when they felt like human rights are at risk. So I think that's a really important point, but maintaining it for what? It wouldn't work. The list is a failure. It would not be effective for its stated purpose. So if you talk with your congressional offices and you ask them to consider this option of repeal, make sure they, please, let them understand the list is useless. We would still have to start from square one anyway, in the event that Congress did declare a draft. And the second piece is that this does nothing to advance equality. It's a fabricated problem that has that it's, you know, that the solution is not meeting in any way.
If I could add to that, unfortunately, our task, or fortunately, our task is not limited or likely to be limited to lobbying. There is a very good chance that selective service will be continued and expanded to women. And so we face the task of supporting as allies the young women now, as well as men who will be faced with this choice. And I think it's really important that we not bring to that some kind of paternalistic perspective that we're trying to protect them against the draft, but recognize their leading role and bring to solidarity and allyship some of the thinking about allyship. You know, what am I doing in the anti-draft movement at age 61? Well, what am I doing trying to work against racism as a white person? What am I doing as a man trying to support feminism? These are the kinds of perspectives that older people need to bring. But we are already late in the game to begin preparing 16-year-old women today for the choices they are likely to have to make in a year and a half. So I'll put a link in the chat to some suggestions of other things that we can do, but it's really important not just to call your congressman, as we'll be doing in the Zap in a few minutes, but also to spread the word, to get discussion going, to talk to young people, let them know that this is in the pipeline and likely. Begin getting groups together, get discussions going on campuses among progressive organizations of other sorts, and encourage ways and find ways to get young people thinking about their choices, speaking out, and amplify their voices in leaders in what is unfortunately likely to be a major struggle over the next few years as this rolls out and either succeeds or fails. I think the evidence is clear that it will fail, but it's not going to fail just automatically. Those young people, those 16-year-old women need our support, and we need to start working on it now.
Thank you
And
both.
I'll mention just two events coming up, or one event coming up and one opportunity for public education for folks who want to be more involved. So the first is that there's a documentary that's recently come out called The Boys Who Said No, which focuses on draft resistance in the Vietnam War era. And so Tori has helpfully put that in the chat. I think it would be great for folks to start hosting screenings, particularly at high schools and on college campuses, as Ed mentioned. These are the age groups that are being targeted. So folks need to know what they're up against. And then the second is that Mass Peace Action in Massachusetts is hosting an event very similar to this one, talking about ending the selective service. If you've been inspired by this conversation and you want to tell your friends, you know, here's an opportunity to learn more, that is happening on August 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And I've just put that in the chat as well. So I would encourage folks to sign up and bring your friends along to that event as well.
Thanks all for your thoughts on that and a little bit of context of what's happening now. I want to move us into a very short question and answer period. I want to make sure we have time to work with you all on some advocacy as well. But there is a few questions that have come up in the chat that I think are really important. So I'm going to ask 3 of them, and you can pick and choose what you can answer in a short piece of time. But one of them is one that comes up a lot. We hear this a lot, right? Won't a draft cause more anti-war resistance and keep us out of endless war? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. There was also some questions about alternative service. What systems are set up if there ever was a draft for folks to do alternative volunteer placements. And third, more about these draft boards. Who can serve? Is that something that pacifists are allowed to do?
Well, geez. Okay, we had an active draft in this country from 1940 until 1973, except for a little over a year. I think it was a year and 4 months back in 47, 48. Didn't stop any wars. Okay, in fact, there were plenty of wars that happened, throughout the world, and lots of, military kinds of actions that didn't blow up into full wars throughout that entire time. And the war, I mean, the height of the anti-Vietnam draft protests were it was 1968. The draft ended in 73. They stopped drafting people. The war went on to 75. So, this notion that having a draft is going to somehow stop wars, that's just bogus. There's just no truth to that at all. Wow. The concerning draft boards, okay, anybody can volunteer to be on the draft board. There are currently draft boards in every county in the country. There's a few inter-county boards, but for the most part, there's at least one draft board per county. Anybody can volunteer to be on the board. You have to be, I think, between the ages of 18 and 80, and you have to be a US citizen and a resident of the area over which the board has jurisdiction. You can be a pacifist. You can be an anti-war activist. In fact, Joe Taczynski was on the draft board for 20 years until you can only be on for 20 years. After 20 years, you have to go off. Joe Taczynski wrote the definitive book on how to beat the draft during Vietnam. And in the 1980s, he volunteered and got on the draft board. Okay, so it's possible. And let me just say that unlike during the Vietnam period, draft boards are being trained this time, which is, I guess, a step in the right direction. But we have friends who are on draft boards who talk to us, and the training is really inadequate, and the anti-CO kind of attitudes on draft board members is still very prevalent in spite of the training. So that answers that question. There was another one.
Yeah, I can jump in on this final question, at least a little bit. There's a question of, what volunteer service alternatives are available right now. Before I worked with the American Friends Service Committee, I worked with the Brethren Volunteer Service, which is exactly one such program that has volunteer opportunities, and that was, originally conceived as a place for conscientious objectors to volunteer in the case of a draft, just like AFSC was. And BVS is still alive and well and is operating, in time of not draft, just for volunteers who want to serve. But those structures do still exist if we ever did need them for conscientious objectors again as well. Does anybody want to add anything on those pieces?
One thing I forgot to mention, in order to be on a draft board, if you are required to register for the draft, you must be registered for the draft.
Well, I also want to say, so Selective Service does maintain an alternative service program, and the last civilian head of that just left recently. Selective Service, which was established, as I mentioned earlier, as a civilian agency, is now the acting director is a current Navy reservist. The entire alternative service program, which is, to place people who resist militarism in civilian directed service, is completely veteran run. The draft boards, isn't the staff reservists, full-time reservists across the paid staff is full-time reservists across the country. So we know, the Center on Conscience and War has heard from folks from the traditional peace churches, and especially very conservative churches, pacifist churches, and their concern to abolish selective service is that, well, this was a hard-fought victory, that selective service would be a civilian agency. Well, that has been deteriorated over the decades, and we say better to scrap it and start anew in the event that Congress does declare a draft.
Thank you all for answering those questions, and for everyone who contributed those questions in the chat. This has been a really engaging conversation with all of you. It's clear we have lots of folks who care deeply about this issue and are very educated on it, and really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us this evening. Thank you to our panelists for sharing as well. We're going to move into a time of some of the easiest advocacy you've ever done. We've prepared a phone zap for you all. For those of you who haven't participated in phone zaps before, essentially we'll provide you the phone number for the Capitol switchboard, which is an easy way to call and reach your legislators, both the Senate and the House. We'll put up a script on the screen that addresses our concerns with the selective service system and urges legislators to support the bills that we've talked about that are in the Senate and the House that would end the selective service for everyone. And Mac is going to walk us through exactly what it'll look like so that there's no surprises, give us an example of how it works when you call the Capitol switchboard and how you can use this script. But first, I'm going to throw the script up on the screen for you all to read. And I'm also going to copy the text of the script into the chat itself for those of you who may be on phones and find it easier to access there. Actually, can I ask one of my fellow presenters to copy that in? I'm having some trouble accessing the chat on my end. But I'm going to share my screen right now to show you this script, and I'll read it out loud so you can all hear our recommended message to Congress. All right, so you should all be able to view my screen now. The Capitol switchboard number is there at the top. It's 202-224-3121. And the text underneath is what we are suggesting you say to Congress. Of course, you're able to adjust this in whatever way feels right to you. If you want to share, your own personal story or your own thoughts on the Selective Service System and the draft, feel free to modify in whatever way makes sense for you. And then the parts that are yellow, that are highlighted yellow, are parts where you just need to make a decision in the moment about what you're going to say. So, a spot for you to insert your name, a spot for you to say where you're from, and then a selection of whether you're talking to the representative or to the senator. And you'll note there that there's HR 2509 and Senate Bill 1139, and you'll just have to reference the one that's relevant to whoever's office you're talking to at that point. The HR one is for the House, and the S is for the Senate. And the same decisions then there at the end of the script. I just have to remember who you're talking to in that moment. And it's not the end of the world if you mess it up either. They'll all be able to figure out which bill you're talking about because they're the same bill, just different numbers. So this script, it goes, hello, my name is blank and I am a constituent from blank. I am calling to ask the representative or senator to support HR 2509 or Senate Bill 1139, which would end the Selective Service registration requirement. Most men in the US are required to register for the draft and face many extrajudicial financial, career, and immigration penalties if they don't, despite the many reasons why someone might oppose participating in preparation for war. Few young men voluntarily comply with the requirement to register, and even fewer inform the Selective Service System each time they move. A former director of the Selective Service System even testified that the registration list would be less than useless for an actual draft. Despite these problems, some members of Congress are proposing expanding the system to women. However, I don't think this is the best way to achieve equality. Instead of expanding a burdensome system to women, we should end the Selective Service registration requirement for everyone. Please tell the representative or senator to oppose efforts to expand the Selective Service and to instead co-sponsor HR 2509 or Senate Bill 1139 to end compulsory draft registration for both men or women. So that's our script. I'm going to toss it over to Mac now for an example of how this will look, and then we'll put this script back up on the screen so that you all can contact your legislators this evening.
Okay, thank you, Tori. I'm going to go ahead and call the switchboard, have it on speed dial here, and I'll put it on speaker so you can all hear what it sounds like. Can I help you? Hi, could you connect me to Congressman Bill Keating's office, please? I don't see a Congressman Keating. Yes, Bill Keating of Massachusetts. Oh, William Keating, you're right. Oh, yes, thank you.
Thank you for calling me, Congressman Bill Keating, proudly representing Massachusetts 9th Congressional District. Our office is open Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Feel free to visit Congressman Keating's website, keating.house.gov, for additional resources. Please leave your name, contact information, and comments after the beep. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you.
Record your message after the tone. When you've finished, you can hang up or press 1 for more options.
Hello, my name is Mac Hamilton, and I'm a constituent from Harwich, and I'm calling Representative Keating to oppose efforts to expand the selective service to include women, and to instead support HR 2509, which would end the selective service registration requirement altogether. As it currently stands, most men in the US are required to register for the draft and face many extrajudicial financial, career, and immigration penalties if they don't, despite the many reasons why someone might oppose participating in preparation for war. Few young men voluntarily comply with the requirement to register, and even fewer inform the selective service system every time they move. A former director of the Selective Service even testified that the registration list would be less than useless in the case of an actual draft. Despite these problems, some members of Congress are proposing expanding the system to include women. However, this is not a feminist action, and it will not achieve equality. Instead of expanding a burdensome system to women, we should instead end the Selective Service registration requirement for everyone. Please tell Representative Keating to oppose efforts to expand the selective service and to instead co-sponsor HR 2509 to end compulsory draft registration for both men and women. Again, my name is Mac Hamilton, and I'm a constituent from Harwich. Thank you. All right, easy peasy. Victoria, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Mac. That was a great example of how these calls go. Super easy because you know you're likely going to get a voicemail today. If anyone needs to check who their representative is, I put a link in the chat where you just put your zip code in and it'll tell you so that you could tell the Capitol switchboard operator who that is. And feel free to throw in the chat if we can help you do that or find your senators if you don't know. So what we're going to do, I'm going to put the script back up and you all can call. We'll be around, all of us who are panelists and moderators. And if we can help you in any way, just throw a question in the chat. And I know some of you will probably be on for a shorter time than others. So I want to close us out preemptively right before we do our phone calls, with a huge thank you to all of you who joined. It's been a really fantastic conversation. Panelists, thank you for your expertise. Those who participated, thank you for the amazing questions and for providing depth to the conversation that we have. And thank you for caring. This is a really big and fast-moving issue. And we really appreciate that all of you took time this evening to be with us and to advocate.